Sometimes, it feels like the ones we trust the most are the ones who do the worst. My brother and I had always been close, bound by our family's traditions and endless memories. We grew up together, served on the same high school sports teams, and even stayed in the same city as adults. That's why it felt so natural to have him and his family over for dinners, birthdays, and casual weekends. I never suspected my brother, and definitely not my wife. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for nearly a decade. We shared 2 beautiful kids, a cozy home, and what I thought was a solid life. I worked as a police officer, balancing the roughness of my job with the peace and warmth that awaited me at home. But as much as I thought I knew her, there were moments when I started to feel a distance. She'd brush it off as stress or exhaustion, but it kept me up at night, nagging at something deep inside me. Then, out of the blue, I received a call from my sister-in-law, Lisa. It wasn't unusual for us to chat, but her voice was sharp with worry this time. She asked if my brother, Mark, had been with us recently. According to her, he'd been acting strange and coming home late. She even laughed it off, joking that maybe he was too busy with work, but I caught the bitterness behind her words. I didn't think much of it then, not until I lay down that night and found a bracelet in our bed. I remember the moment I saw it, a delicate piece with a gold charm dangling from it. I knew it wasn't Sarah's. It was the kind of bracelet my wife would never wear. I held it up, and when Sarah saw it, her face went pale. Her excuses were weak, her words stumbling as she tried to brush it off. She claimed she didn't know where it came from, that maybe one of our daughter's friends left it behind. But something felt wrong. After that night, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something sinister was unfolding behind my back. My instincts as a police officer kicked in, and I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. I installed a small camera in the bedroom, hidden just well enough that no one would ever notice. The fact that it had come to this broke my heart, but I needed proof if my suspicions were true. For weeks, I didn't catch anything unusual. Life went on as usual. I'd get up early for work, take the kids to school, and spend the day patrolling the streets, facing strangers' problems while my own crept silently in the background. I tried to push away the doubts during family dinners, even as Sarah smiled and laughed with the kids. But I felt a shift in our routine, a subtle but unmistakable distance between us that only seemed to grow with time. It wasn't until a month later that I finally got a notification from the camera. I had nearly forgotten about the camera setup. Between the daily grind and doing my best to keep our family life normal, my patience was wearing thin. But that day, as I was wrapping up a long shift at the station, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the camera app. Someone was in my bedroom. Adrenaline surged through me. I tried to keep my face neutral, to not let the guys at the station see that anything was wrong. But inside, a storm was brewing. Quickly, I pulled up the feed and saw a live view of my own bedroom. And there, plain as day, was my brother. He was lying in my bed, his shirt halfway unbuttoned, looking too comfortable. Then I saw Sarah slip into the room. The sight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. I felt like I was watching a stranger's life fall apart on camera. My mind raced between disbelief, anger, and the cold, hard need for justice. Here was my own brother, and my own wife, 2 people I trusted more than anything else in this world, violating the very space I held sacred. Rage pulsed through me, and I made my decision in a heartbeat. As a police officer, I had access to a crew on call. Without giving any specifics, I radioed in for backup, saying only that I needed assistance for a domestic matter. The crew didn't ask questions, they knew me well enough to know that I wouldn't make a request like this unless it was serious. The clock ticked torturously as I drove home, my mind racing over how I'd handle it. I knew that if I stormed in there alone, I might do something I'd regret. But I wanted this to be handled lawfully, so there could be no doubt or excuse. When I pulled into the driveway, I motioned for the crew to stay behind until I was ready. I walked in quietly, my footsteps masked by the carpet. I didn't need to enter the room to know what I would find. My heart thundered in my chest as I opened the door, and there they were, my brother, half-naked and startled, and Sarah, her expression frozen in horror. "You have two choices," I said, my voice as cold as steel. "Put your clothes on and come with me, or I'll drag you out like this." Mark scrambled, his face as red as fire. Sarah tried to stammer something, a pathetic excuse or an explanation, but I couldn't hear it. My focus was on Mark. Without a word, I handcuffed him. He looked at me, pleading, but I offered no sympathy. The ride to the station was silent, but I could feel his eyes on me in the rearview mirror, full of shame and fear. And I didn't care. As soon as we reached the station, I processed him like any other criminal. I informed the on-duty officers that he was here on suspicion of theft, and that was that. My brother was booked and taken into holding. For the next 3 days, he would sit in a cell and think about his actions. At home, Sarah was left to face the cold reality of what she'd done. I filed for a lawsuit against both of them, Sarah for fraud and my brother for a string of fabricated charges that I knew would keep him occupied. It wasn't about the charges, it was about sending a message. In the days that followed, I focused on my kids, trying to restore some semblance of stability for them. They didn't know what happened, and I intended to keep it that way as long as possible. I was determined to protect them, to make sure they felt secure and loved even if our home was now just a broken shadow of what it had been. Then, there was Lisa, my brother's wife. She came by, looking as broken as I felt. I let her in, offering her nothing more than a nod. We both understood the betrayal we had suffered, but I wasn't interested in sharing any words of comfort. I didn't want pity, and I wasn't about to give it. The days after the arrest were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and an endless stream of people trying to tell me what I should do next. Friends, colleagues, even family members tried to insert themselves into the situation, but I was done listening to anyone. This was between me, Sarah, and Mark. They had betrayed me in the most unforgivable way, and now I was going to make sure they paid for it. The first few days after Mark's arrest were the hardest. I had to keep a calm, professional face at work, but at home, I was barely holding it together. Sarah was a wreck. She didn't cry, though, no, it was worse. She was cold, numb, even. She refused to speak about what had happened, and I wasn't going to beg her to. Every time I tried to ask her anything, she'd look away or pretend to be busy with the kids, as if life could just go on. I remember one night, sitting at the kitchen table, the empty plates in front of me reflecting the distance between us. My kids were upstairs, probably still too young to fully understand the mess that their parents were in. I had hoped it wouldn't affect them, but it was hard to ignore the tension in the air. I had never felt so alone in my own home. Even when I wasn't actively thinking about it, I could feel the weight of everything crashing down on me. Sarah finally spoke up one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to do it like that," she said, her eyes hard as she looked at me across the table. "You didn't have to call the police." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she didn't get to decide how this played out, but I held it in. The cold rage I'd felt earlier had turned into a deep, soul-crushing hurt, and I didn't want to waste it on her. I had made my decisions, and I was going to live with them. If she thought she could manipulate me into feeling sorry for her, she was sorely mistaken. "Don't try to make this my fault," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You made your choices. I'm just dealing with the consequences." She stared at me for a long moment, like she was trying to find something to say, but then she just stood up and left the room. I didn't follow her. There was nothing left to say. Our marriage was over. A few days later, Mark was released on bail. But his return was far from a reunion. When he showed up at the house, I made sure to have the locks changed and every door and window reinforced. I didn't trust him anymore. Not that I had any desire to confront him. I didn't want to look at him, much less hear his excuses. I went back to work, throwing myself into the grind of being a cop. It felt good to have something to focus on that didn't remind me of the betrayal at home. But it didn't change the fact that every day felt like I was walking around with a broken heart in my chest. How could I have been so blind? How could I have been so naive, trusting both of them? In the meantime, Sarah began to show signs of regret. At least, I thought it was regret. She started cooking dinner again, trying to make things right. She started doing little things I hadn't seen her do in a long time, like cleaning the house or helping the kids with homework. But I wasn't buying it. There was no magic fix for this. No sorry would ever undo the damage that had been done. As for my brother, the trial was looming. I had him charged with robbery, even though I knew the charges were a little inflated. I just wanted to make sure that he understood what he had taken from me, what he had taken from us. He had betrayed me on a level I couldn't have imagined. And the worst part? He knew exactly how much this would hurt. He had done it before, in little ways, always testing the boundaries of what I would tolerate. Now, he had crossed a line I would never forgive. It wasn't long before Lisa, his wife, came to visit. She stood on the porch, looking lost, her face pale from lack of sleep. I didn't answer the door at first. I wasn't ready to face her yet. But she kept knocking, and after a few minutes, I reluctantly opened the door. "I just need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for everything. I don't know what's happening. Mark's been distant, and I had no idea about any of this. I didn't invite her inside. I couldn't. I wasn't sure what she wanted from me." "What exactly are you sorry for?" I asked coldly. "For your husband's actions, or for the fact that you didn't see it coming either?" Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't want to comfort her. She was just another victim of her own ignorance, like I was. "I know this sounds crazy, but I don't think Mark ever meant for things to get this bad," she said, almost pleading. "He's been in a dark place for a while. He wasn't himself. And now I'm losing everything." I wanted to tell her that I didn't care about her problems, that I had my own mess to deal with. But instead, I just nodded. "You're right. You're losing everything. And so am I." With that, I closed the door on her. I didn't want her in my life. I didn't want anything from her. This was my fight now, and I was done with both of them. The trial was the turning point. It was the moment when everything I had been pushing down, trying to ignore, finally came to light. For weeks, I prepared for it like I would prepare for an investigation, carefully, with precision. But even with all my professional experience, nothing could have prepared me for the emotional wreckage that came with sitting across from my brother in that courtroom. Mark was standing trial for robbery, but everyone in that room knew the real charge was betrayal. My lawyer had pulled together a case that would tie him to the crimes I had fabricated, small, non-violent thefts, all strategically chosen so they wouldn't risk too much of a sentence. It wasn't about the charges themselves, it was about the message I wanted to send. I needed Mark to understand the extent of his betrayal, to feel the weight of the consequences of his actions. The moment he walked into the courtroom, my heart lurched. He looked different, disheveled, gaunt, broken. His eyes were bloodshot from sleepless nights, and I could tell he hadn't been eating. But none of that mattered. None of it would change what he had done to me, to my family. He was the architect of this destruction, and he needed to pay for it. The prosecutor began, laying out the charges with a kind of detached professionalism. But all I could think about was the first time I caught Mark and Sarah together, the night they had betrayed me. The picture of them in my bed, my brother's naked body tangled with my wife's, it haunted me, and I could feel the bile rise in my throat every time I tried to focus on anything else. As the trial progressed, the details of Mark's life came to light. How he had been sneaking around, taking advantage of his position in my life to make moves on Sarah. How he had been using his charm, his manipulation, to break down her walls, and how she had, in turn, fallen for it. The evidence was clear. My lawyer presented the recordings from my hidden camera, showing the two of them in compromising positions, and the courtroom buzzed with disbelief as they both became exposed. Mark's defense was laughable. He tried to claim that he was drunk, that he didn't know what he was doing. But I could see through it. This wasn't about alcohol. This was about choices. This was about two people deciding that they wanted to destroy everything I had worked for. The worst part of it all, though, was Sarah's testimony. She took the stand, her face pale and worn, her eyes shifting nervously as she was forced to relive everything. She couldn't look at me, couldn't face the consequences of her actions. But the worst blow came when she admitted, on the stand, that she had been seeing Mark for months. That she had known exactly what she was doing when she crossed the line. I didn't mean for it to happen, she said, her voice shaky. It just happened. I was lonely. Mark understood me. Her words hit me like a slap. Lonely? After everything I had done for her, for us? The house I had built, the sacrifices I had made. And this is how she repaid me. By sleeping with my brother, a man I had trusted more than anyone in this world. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, my hands trembling with the fury that was boiling inside me. You think that's an excuse? You think lonely is a valid reason for tearing apart a family? I shouted, my voice breaking through the courtroom. You're nothing but a liar, a cheat. You've ruined everything, and for what? The judge called for order, but I didn't care. This was the end of it all. This was the moment I could finally speak the truth, even if it cost me everything. Sarah was convicted of fraud. The jury saw through her lies and manipulations. I couldn't bring myself to feel relief, though. The damage had been done. No conviction would ever fix this. She was a fraud, a liar, but even worse, she had broken the bond we shared. The marriage I had fought so hard to build had crumbled before my eyes. As for Mark, the trial was a mess. His charges didn't stick as firmly as I wanted them to, but it didn't matter. In the end, he was convicted of theft. He would serve time in a facility, but that wasn't enough. Nothing could bring back the family I had lost. The hardest part of all was coming home. Coming back to the empty house, to the silence that now lived within its walls. It was just me and the kids. I did my best to shield them from the horrors of everything that had happened. I wanted to protect them from the cruelty of the world, from the darkness that had taken root in my life. But as much as I tried, it didn't always work. There were moments when the kids would ask about their mother, about why she wasn't around anymore. It broke my heart every time, and I did my best to explain things in a way they could understand. I told them that their mother wasn't coming back, that we needed to move forward, and that no matter what, they would always have me. 3 days after the trial, Mark was sent away to serve his sentence. It felt final. It felt like everything had come crashing down, but at least now I had closure. At least I knew that he had paid for his actions. But that didn't make it any easier. The house was quieter now, emptier. No more laughter from the kids. No more Sarah's cooking in the kitchen. Just the hollow sound of my footsteps echoing through rooms that had once been filled with love and warmth. The days following the trial were like stepping into a new, unfamiliar world. Everything that had defined my life for so long was now shattered, like glass strewn across a floor. I spent the first few nights alone in the house, the kids staying with their grandparents. The emptiness of the rooms weighed down on me like a 1,000-pound anchor. The silence was deafening, and it was all I could do to keep from losing myself in it. I didn't know how to function anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, the way he looked when the handcuffs were put on him. The shame in his eyes didn't help. I wanted him to feel the full weight of his betrayal, but all I could see was a man broken and ruined. And then, I'd see Sarah's face, her vacant expression as she admitted what she had done. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with everything, reduced to nothing more than a liar. I threw myself into work. It was the only thing that kept me from losing my mind. Being a police officer had always been my escape. The routine, the structure, the sense of purpose, it all gave me something to hold on to. But even there, I wasn't immune to the whispers. My colleagues knew what had happened. Word spreads fast in a town like this, and soon I became the subject of hushed conversations and sidelong glances. They didn't say it outright, but I knew they were all judging me, wondering how I had let it all go so wrong. As much as I tried to focus on my job, the truth kept intruding. The weight of the betrayal seemed to seep into every corner of my life. Even the smallest things, picking up a coffee cup, answering the phone, became reminders of what had been lost. I couldn't escape it. I kept thinking about the kids. They were too young to understand the gravity of the situation, but they could sense the tension, the changes in their home. I could see it in their eyes, questions without answers. They didn't ask about their mother, but I knew they were wondering where she had gone. Why she wasn't around anymore. One day, I took the kids to the park. They needed a break from the heaviness, from the constant reminder of what had happened. I needed a break too. I watched them play, their laughter ringing out like a sweet, innocent reminder of what truly mattered. It was in those moments that I realized they were the only things keeping me going. But even at the park, I wasn't truly free. As I sat on the bench, watching the kids, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I took it out, expecting it to be work-related, but it wasn't. It was a message from Lisa, Mark's wife. "I need to talk to you. I know what happened. Please, just hear me out." I stared at the message for a long time, unsure of what to do. I had told myself I was done with her. She had chosen Mark over me, and now, here she was, trying to weasel her way back into my life. But something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I wasn't going to be anyone's second choice. I wasn't going to let her think she could come to me for comfort, for forgiveness, when she had done nothing but betray me too. I responded simply, "You have nothing to say to me." The message didn't sit well with me, though. Even as I put my phone down, I could feel the temptation pulling at me. There was a part of me that still wanted to hear her out, wanted to know what kind of excuse she could possibly offer. But I quickly shook the thought away. I wasn't going to let myself be pulled back into this mess. It was over. It had to be over. I spent the next few days avoiding her calls, blocking her from every possible avenue. But somehow, she kept reaching out. She showed up at the house once, knocking at the door, but I didn't answer. I couldn't bring myself to face her. The idea of talking to her, of hearing her out, was too much. She was part of the reason I had lost everything. Then, one morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when the phone rang again. It was from the station, but this time it wasn't a work-related call. It was about Mark. I was on edge, unsure of what had happened now, what kind of mess he had gotten into this time. The officer on the other end told me that Mark had tried to contact Sarah from jail. He was being kept in solitary confinement for attempting to bribe a guard, and the conversation was disturbing. He was talking about plans, about coming back to the house, about making things right. I immediately set up a meeting with my lieutenant, making sure that the situation was under control. I wasn't going to let Mark come back and destroy what little peace I had left. I wasn't going to let him use Sarah or manipulate her into helping him get out of prison. By the time I was heading out of the station that day, I realized I was no longer the same man I had been before all of this. I had been broken, yes, but I had also been rebuilt. I was stronger than I had ever been. My priorities had shifted. My kids, my work, my own well-being, they were all that mattered now. And Sarah? She was a distant memory, a lesson learned in pain and betrayal. It was over. A week passed after the phone call about Mark. Life didn't feel like it was back to normal, because it wasn't. It was as if I was walking through a fog, trying to get through each day without falling apart. The kids were adjusting better than I expected, but there were moments when I could see them searching my face for answers to questions I couldn't give them. They were too young to understand fully, but they could sense the tension that lingered in the air. They could feel the absence of their mother, the void that her actions had left in all our lives. I still couldn't get used to the empty space in the house, the echo of Sarah's absence in the kitchen, the silence that greeted me when I walked through the front door. The furniture, the pictures on the wall, the bed sheets we had once shared, it all felt foreign now. Every object reminded me of the woman who had betrayed me, who had shattered the life we had built together. The weight of the betrayal wasn't just an emotional burden, it had physical repercussions too. I felt drained, hollowed out by the lies, the manipulation. I barely slept, my mind racing at all hours of the night, replaying every detail over and over in my head. It felt like I couldn't escape it, like the memory of what they had done was carved into my soul, permanent and unforgiving. I took time off work, partly because I was exhausted, but also because I couldn't bear to face anyone. I didn't want to be that guy who had his whole life fall apart. I didn't want the pity in their eyes, the whispers behind my back. Even though I knew people were talking, I didn't care anymore. My focus was on the kids, on trying to salvage something from the wreckage. The phone rang a few days later. It was Lisa, Mark's wife, again. I didn't even have to think about it. I didn't answer. But she didn't stop. I was surprised by how persistent she was, how much she seemed to think I owed her an explanation, an ear. She sent messages, all sorts of them, pleading for forgiveness, for understanding. She even called my work phone, and I had to block it too. She was relentless, but it was clear now that I had to make a decision. I could either allow her to continue trying to worm her way into my life, or I could cut her off completely. There was no middle ground. It wasn't just her, though. It was everyone else. Sarah's family came by to check on me. How was I doing? How were the kids? They had been more supportive in the past, but now their visits felt like a reminder of everything I had lost. They were all just as complicit as Sarah. They had enabled her. They hadn't said anything when they knew the marriage was falling apart, when they saw the cracks in Sarah's behavior, the way she had drifted away. They all acted like nothing had changed, as if everything was the same. They all wanted to pretend that nothing was broken, that it was just a phase. But I wasn't fooling myself. The kids' birthdays were coming up, and it was around that time that I realized I was going to have to confront the issue head-on. They were going to ask questions about Sarah. I knew they would want to see her again, or at least hear from her. The thought of them crying, asking where their mother was unbearable. I didn't know how to explain to them that their mother wasn't coming back. She wasn't a hero in this story. She wasn't coming to fix things, and I wasn't going to let her destroy any more of their innocence. I decided to sit them down one evening, after dinner. The house was quiet, the smell of their favorite takeout lingering in the air, and I had no idea how to begin. I could see the look in their eyes, the curiosity, the confusion. They hadn't asked yet, but I knew it was coming. "Where's Mom?" my son, Jason, asked, his voice small and unsure. His innocent face broke my heart. I hadn't realized how much he had been carrying. He hadn't said a word since we had moved into this new, empty life. But now, his question was inevitable. He needed to know. I looked at my daughter, Sarah, her blonde hair pulled into a ponytail, her eyes wide with confusion. She was older, and I could tell she already suspected that something wasn't right. She was quieter, more withdrawn than usual. The smile that once lit up her face was gone. I had to face the truth. They needed to understand, even if it broke me to say it. "Mom isn't coming back," I said, my voice thick. It wasn't easy to say those words, but I forced myself to. Why? Jason asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. He didn't fully understand, but he knew enough to sense that something was wrong. Sarah reached out, grabbing my hand tightly, her small fingers squeezing it for reassurance. Because she made choices, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. Choices that hurt us. Choices that broke our family. I could see the pain in their eyes. Jason started to cry, and Sarah wrapped her arms around him, trying to comfort him. It was a bittersweet moment, one of grief, but also of clarity. They didn't need to know the full details of what had happened, but they needed to know that their mother had made a choice, and that I had made mine too. I'll always be here, I said softly. I'll always take care of you. You're my everything. And no matter what happens, we'll get through this together. It wasn't the perfect explanation. There were still so many questions that went unanswered. But for that moment, it was enough. I could see the weight lift off their shoulders, just a little. They didn't have to worry anymore. They knew I was there for them. It wasn't just my family I had to deal with. The community, the people who had known me and Sarah for years, also had their expectations. And they were relentless. Every person I encountered had some opinion, some piece of advice on how I should deal with Sarah, how I should forgive Mark, how I should move on. But no one knew what I had been through. No one understood the depth of the betrayal I had felt. I knew I had to sever all ties with the past, no matter how hard it seemed. It wasn't just Sarah that needed to be erased from my life, it was the entire world that had allowed her to think she could get away with it. And, of course, there was Mark. My brother. The one person I trusted more than anyone else. The one person who had turned on me in the most unimaginable way. One afternoon, while I was going through some old family albums, trying to find something to show the kids, something to keep them grounded, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me pick up. Hello. I answered, my voice hoarse from the endless nights of barely any sleep. There was a pause on the other end of the line before a familiar voice spoke. Jake, it's Lisa. I froze. Lisa, Mark's wife. What did she want from me now? I know you've been avoiding me, she said, almost pleading. But I really need to talk to you. Please, Jake. I know things are hard, but I just want to explain. I gripped the phone tighter, fighting the urge to slam it down. Every fiber of my being wanted to shut her down. To tell her that she didn't deserve another moment of my time. But there was a strange curiosity creeping in, something dark and dangerous that wanted to hear what she had to say. She had been with my brother. She knew what happened. She was just as guilty as they were. I don't want to hear it, Lisa, I snapped. You and Mark, what you did to me, to my family, it's over. There's nothing left to explain. But she wasn't giving up. Please, Jake, just meet with me. We can talk. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I need to clear my conscience. Your conscience. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. You don't get a clear conscience after what you did. What both of you did. There was silence on the other end for a moment before Lisa spoke again, her voice breaking. Jake, I know it's a mess. I know it doesn't make sense, but I was scared. Mark has always been controlling, you know that. He's been in and out of jail, he used me to get to you. To get close to your life. Her words stung like a slap, but I couldn't bring myself to feel any sympathy. I didn't want to hear any more excuses. Lisa was just as complicit, and I had no desire to make peace with her or anyone else involved in this twisted betrayal. I don't care, I said coldly. You've done enough damage already. I don't want to see you. I don't want to talk. Stay away from my family. I ended the call before she could say anything else. My heart was racing, my blood boiling with anger. It wasn't just Mark or Sarah anymore, it was everyone who had ever enabled them. Everyone who had stood by while my life crumbled. A few days later, Lisa showed up at the house. I don't know what I expected, but I wasn't ready for it. She was standing at the doorstep, her face pale, her eyes wide with desperation. "I'm not going away, Jake," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to hear me out. I can't keep living like this. I need you to understand." I felt my hands clench into fists. I was done. She had no right to show up at my door, no right to make demands. I was already dealing with the wreckage of my life. I didn't need her or anyone else complicating it. "You need to leave. Now." But she didn't. She stood there, looking at me with pleading eyes, refusing to move. It took every ounce of restraint not to lose control. I didn't want to be the kind of man who hit a woman, but in that moment, I felt like she was pushing me to the edge. "Get off my property," I said again, my voice low and dangerous. "You're not welcome here." Finally, she backed away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She didn't say anything as she turned and walked down the driveway, but I knew she would keep trying. She didn't know how to let go, just like Mark didn't. As I watched her disappear from sight, something cold and final settled inside me. This was it. I wasn't going to let anyone, least of all Lisa, manipulate me or my family anymore. I had drawn the line, and I was sticking to it. I wasn't going to fall for their games or their guilt trips. This was my life now, and I was going to rebuild it on my own terms. The tension in the house was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every door that slammed, every single breath I took, it felt like I was drowning in a sea of my own rage and betrayal. Sarah had broken me, Mark had humiliated me, and Lisa, well, she'd been the final straw. But despite it all, I still had my kids. I still had the one thing that mattered, my family. And I was going to protect them with everything I had left. The days blurred into each other. My schedule revolved around work and the kids: drop them off at school, pick them up, take them to their activities, tuck them into bed. I tried to keep things as normal as possible for their sake, but the normal I once knew was long gone. The house felt empty, as if it had been hollowed out by the weight of what had happened. Sarah's absence was felt in every room, but so was her betrayal. The worst part wasn't just the loss, it was the constant feeling of being betrayed by everyone I had ever trusted. It wasn't just Mark or Sarah, it was the entire web of people who had enabled their actions. The friends we had invited into our home, the family members who had been blind to Sarah's behavior, the colleagues who had probably known what was going on and hadn't said a word. It made me sick to think of how many people had lied to my face, pretending everything was fine. But nothing felt fine anymore. I'd gotten used to waking up early to get things in order. The routine was my only anchor in the chaos of my life. I wasn't used to feeling so broken, so torn apart. But my work, being a police officer, had become my escape. It was the one place where I could focus, where I could pretend that things weren't falling apart. I threw myself into my job like never before. It gave me a sense of control, something I desperately needed after everything that had unraveled. It was on one of those days when I was getting ready to head out to work that I received a call. It was from the station. "Jake, we need you to come in," the voice on the other end said. "There's something you need to see. It's urgent." I knew something was off. I wasn't sure what it was, but the urgency in the officer's tone sent a chill through my body. I told the kids I'd be back soon, kissed them on the forehead, and left for the station. It was time to face whatever the world had been keeping from me. When I arrived at the precinct, I was met by two detectives. One was a seasoned officer who I had known for years, and the other was a new face. They looked at me seriously, as if they were about to drop a bombshell. I already had a feeling that this was something I couldn't avoid. "Jake, we've been going through some of the surveillance footage," the older officer, Bill, said. "There's something we need to show you." I nodded, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. They led me to the back room, where a computer screen displayed footage from a camera I didn't even know we had in the house. It was the bedroom. The trap I had set up. And sure enough, there was a man standing in my bed. A man who had no business being there. It was Mark. My brother. There he was, caught on camera, completely unaware that his every move was being recorded. I could feel my stomach drop as I watched him walk around the room, undressing Sarah's clothes, touching the things that were mine, acting like he owned everything in my life. He didn't even look guilty. He didn't seem to care that he was betraying me, that he was destroying everything I had worked so hard to build. The footage continued, and I saw them, Sarah and Mark, interacting in ways that were more than just casual. Their touch was intimate, their laughter too close, their smiles too secretive. I could feel my heart beat faster with each passing second. The evidence was undeniable. The proof was right there in front of me. "We need you to take action, Jake," Bill said, his voice almost apologetic. "This isn't just an affair. This is bigger than that. It's a crime. You've got the surveillance, but we need you to make the move. We need you to do what's right." I wasn't sure what that meant. "What are you suggesting?" I asked, my voice steady but shaking beneath the surface. "Theft. Fraud. You've got everything you need to press charges." For a moment, everything went still. The anger inside me had already been simmering, but now it was like a fire that had been stoked to its breaking point. I had all the evidence I needed. I could make them pay for what they had done. It was time to make Mark regret ever betraying me. It was time to make Sarah realize the cost of her choices. This wasn't just about an affair, it was about justice. About standing up for what was mine. Without another word, I stood up, my decision already made. I called the station and ordered a crew to meet me at my house. This was going to be handled quickly, professionally, and with no room for mercy. It wasn't just about catching Mark anymore. It was about showing the world that I wouldn't let anyone, no matter who they were, destroy my life and get away with it. When I arrived back at the house, the adrenaline pumping through me made my skin feel tight, my heart beating like a drum in my chest. This wasn't just a house I was entering, it was a battleground. The very air felt charged with the energy of all the rage, betrayal, and disgust that had been building up for the past month. It was all leading to this moment. The walls seemed to close in around me as I waited for the crew to arrive. I couldn't let them see the way I was shaking. I couldn't let them see the years of pain I'd been holding in. The kids were at school. Sarah was gone, thankfully. But Mark was still here, somewhere inside my home, where he had no business being. As the other officers arrived, we moved into position, preparing for the moment we would confront him. I could almost taste the satisfaction of it, but it wasn't sweet. It wasn't even justice. It was the cold certainty of betrayal, the grim necessity of taking control. "We've got eyes on the house," one of the officers told me as he walked toward me, nodding towards the window. "We're good to go. You ready for this?" I took a deep breath. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. "Let's do it." We moved quickly, efficiently, slipping into the house like shadows. The entire operation felt clinical. I'd seen it all before on the job, but now, it was personal. This wasn't just a criminal bust, it was family. My brother. My wife. The people I had trusted above all others. The moment we entered the house, everything seemed to slow down. I walked through the front door and paused, listening. There was no sound. No movement. It was as if Mark knew what was coming. My instincts kicked in, there was something eerie about the stillness, but I couldn't let my guard down. Not now. The bedroom was the first place we checked, and sure enough, there he was. Mark was lying in my bed, naked, sprawled across the sheets like he owned the place. He didn't see us at first, his back to the door. It was only when I moved forward, stepping into the room, that he turned around, his eyes widening in shock. "What the hell?" he stammered, his face pale with fear. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape, but there was none. He was trapped. "You've got a lot of explaining to do, Mark," I said, my voice cold and emotionless. "Get up." The moment the words left my mouth, he scrambled to sit up, his hands reaching for the blanket, trying to cover himself. But I wasn't giving him the chance. I was already moving toward him, my badge clearly visible on my chest. "Put your hands behind your back," I commanded, my voice sharp and unwavering. "You're under arrest." Mark's mouth went dry. He looked up at me, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "Jake, no. You don't understand." "I understand everything, Mark," I cut him off. "You're in my bed, in my house, with my wife. You're not going to talk your way out of this." I motioned for the officers to move in, and they quickly subdued him, cuffing his hands behind his back. He didn't resist, he knew there was no point in trying. They dragged him out of the room and down the stairs, but I stayed behind for a moment. I couldn't bring myself to look at the bed, the place where he had desecrated everything. It was hard to believe that the man I had once looked up to, the man who had been my closest ally, was now nothing more than a stranger. A criminal. I walked out of the bedroom, but before I left, I paused in the hallway. I turned back to the room and looked at it one more time. The damage was done, but this wasn't about closure. It was about taking control of the situation. It was about showing Mark, and everyone else, that I wasn't a victim anymore. By the time we reached the car, Mark was silent. He didn't try to plead, didn't beg for mercy. He just sat there, staring at the floor as if he had given up. But I knew better. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't ashamed. He was just scared. Scared of the consequences. Scared of me. We drove to the station in silence, the car vibrating with the tension in the air. I didn't look at him once, not even when we arrived. I let the officers take care of the formalities. I didn't need to be the one to process this. I had already done that in my mind, long before the arrest. The next few days felt like a blur. I threw myself into the paperwork, the legal side of things. The evidence was irrefutable, Mark was guilty, and so was Sarah. It didn't matter that they were family. They were going to face the consequences of their actions. It was the only way forward. It wasn't just about punishing them. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about sending a message. To them. To myself. To anyone who thought they could destroy what I had built without facing repercussions. 3 days later, I filed charges. Theft. Fraud. Conspiracy. It didn't matter what they said, they couldn't talk their way out of it. The evidence was too clear. I'd put everything I had into making sure they would pay for what they had done. But in the quiet moments, when the paperwork was done and the kids were in bed, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace. I had done what I needed to do. I had taken control. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe. I could look at my children and know that I was doing the right thing. I wasn't going to let their mother's mistakes or my brother's betrayal define our future. We were going to move forward, together. It's funny how quickly everything changes once you've taken the first step toward reclaiming control. The weight that had been pressing down on my chest for weeks, even months, slowly began to lift. I'd made my decisions, and there was no turning back. But the aftermath, the way things unfolded after Mark was arrested, was something I couldn't have prepared for. 3 days had passed since I filed the charges. The police had finished their initial investigation, and Mark was being held at the station. Sarah, on the other hand, was at home, packing her things. I had already changed the locks, and the moment she arrived, I handed her a stack of papers, divorce papers, custody agreements, financial settlements. I didn't need to say a word. She knew what was happening. There was no pretending anymore. There was no fixing what we had. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were red, puffy. She hadn't been sleeping well, not that I cared. "Jake, you don't understand. This isn't what it looks like." "Don't try to justify this, Sarah," I interrupted, my voice cold and unfeeling. "You've been caught. There's nothing left to say." Her face twisted into something between anger and desperation. "You don't know what you're doing." I was confused. "It wasn't like you think. I love you. I made a mistake, okay?" I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. But instead, I just stared at her. This woman, the one I had loved, the mother of my children, was standing in front of me, trying to lie her way out of everything. It was pathetic. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done to me. She was sorry for getting caught. "I don't want to hear it," I said. "You made your choice, Sarah. And now you'll have to live with the consequences." She didn't say anything else. Instead, she grabbed her things, slowly and methodically, like she was going through the motions. But I could see the anger in her eyes. The betrayal. She wasn't just upset that I had caught her, she was upset because I had the power now. She was losing control, and that was the last thing she ever wanted. As she walked out the door, she paused for a moment, as if she was waiting for me to stop her. I didn't. I didn't even look up. She slammed the door behind her, and I was left standing in the empty house, feeling nothing. The days after Sarah's departure felt like a blur. My focus was on the kids, keeping their lives as stable as possible. I was determined not to let this affect them more than it already had. They needed to feel secure, to know that everything was going to be okay. But there was something else, too. A sense of emptiness that lingered. As much as I wanted to just move on, to forget about what had happened, I couldn't. The fact that Mark, my own brother, had done this to me was something I couldn't shake. I kept thinking about the betrayal, about how easily he had slipped into my life and my home, as if he were entitled to everything I had worked for. I still couldn't wrap my head around it. I wasn't just angry at him. I was disgusted. He had taken everything from me without a second thought. And worse, he hadn't even been sorry for it. It wasn't like he had been some long-lost friend or a casual acquaintance. No, Mark was my brother. We had shared our lives, our childhood, our family. We had built this bond over years, and now that bond was shattered. The thought of him, of what he had done, lingered in my mind constantly. I tried to push it away. I tried to focus on the kids, on the things I could control. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face. Every time I sat down for a meal, I imagined him sitting at the table, pretending like nothing was wrong. But I couldn't avoid it forever. One afternoon, just a few days after Sarah left, I received a message from Lisa, Mark's wife. It was unexpected. I had been avoiding her, staying away from the contact between us. I didn't want to deal with her. She was just as guilty in all of this. But the message was simple. "Can we talk? Please, I need to explain." I didn't know what I expected. Maybe I thought she was reaching out to apologize. But I didn't care. Not really. The betrayal ran too deep for me to even consider forgiving anyone, especially her. Still, I didn't ignore the message. I had to know what she was going to say. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop the next day, but I wasn't interested in a conversation. I wasn't interested in hearing any excuses or explanations. I was done with that. When I saw her sitting at the table, looking like she hadn't slept in days, I felt a strange sense of indifference. She looked at me, her eyes wide, as if she was trying to gauge my mood. But I didn't care about her feelings. I wasn't here for any of that. "Jake," she started, her voice shaking. Save it, Lisa," I cut her off, my voice sharp. "I don't want to hear what you have to say. You and Mark can try to justify it however you want, but I know the truth. You both betrayed me. I'm not going to let you play the victim here. She flinched, but I wasn't sorry. I had no sympathy for her. Not anymore. I just wanted to apologize, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't know what came over him. It's too late for apologies, I replied, my voice cold. You've already ruined everything. My family, my life, everything's destroyed. I don't want to have anything to do with you, Lisa. You and Mark are dead to me. Her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't care. I stood up, turned my back, and walked out. I didn't look back. There was nothing more to say. The days dragged on, but I began to feel like I was finally moving on. I had my children, I had my job, and I was rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like the world had crumbled beneath me. But I was starting to piece it back together. One step at a time. I didn't care if Mark was locked up or if Lisa was crying over the mess they had created. I wasn't looking for revenge. I wasn't looking for closure. I just wanted peace, for myself, for my kids, for the future. And slowly, but surely, I was finding it.